from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will talk about how the worries in the stock market caused the post-harvest rally in the grain markets to pause this week, and he'll pass along his latest price probability projections for corn. Following Dan, then, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz returns with considerations this time on taking crop soil samples in dry field conditions. Dorivar says that you producers need to take that dryness into account when pulling cores from fields, and he'll talk about how those dry soils impact soil nutrient activity, especially in no-till fields. And standing by to talk Kansas agricultural weather with us, K-State's Mary Knapp. All that and more next on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. Thanks for being along with us. It's to the grain markets, first off right here, in the company of Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Well, Dan, the grain trades, generally speaking, hit a speed bump the last couple of days after several sessions of rising prices. And what do you point to as the reason for that directly?
I think broader volatility in all U.S. markets with the approaching of the U.S. election, likely a big factor here as you look at what's happened in the Dow Jones Industrial Index. We had been trading up about 29,000. Last several days fell down to 27, 26. And a lot of that's just uncertainty as to where things are going. And, of course, the stock market and the financial markets are affected. But when money moves around in those broader financial and equity markets, it affects commodities. And so the ag commodities are affected. And look at the export business. Last few days, et cetera, not a lot has changed. In fact, still some purchases coming on. So it would seem that as we talk here on Friday and that election happening middle part of next week, that this would almost be the point of expectation. And so there's both risk and there's probably opportunities. Probably if things turn to the low side, might be great buying opportunities for foreign buyers too. So it's going to be a real show in terms of what's going to happen and things going different directions. Coming into, during, and after the election with all the rigmarole and the emotion and emotiveness that'll come through that in our country. And without question, that type of, I guess, exuberance and of expressing one's opinion and fears and hopes will no doubt come out of the main financial markets and affect us on the ag side.
Lending to the hope that this is merely a pause in the rally we've seen in the grain prices. And you touched upon it. The grain export news of late has been not bad at all, and China is front and center. But you stress as well, don't sleep on Mexico here.
Well, yes. We've, of course, been paying lots and lots of attention to China and how they'll fulfill their TRQs and whether the USDA numbers are underestimating what China will buy for corn, if not other crops. So first, in terms of looking at Mexico, it is dry there. We're not paying a lot of attention to that, but you look at the weather maps we have in our weekly report, and Mexico is just as hard bitten for moisture the last 30 days and not doing wonderful for the last 90 as any place in North America. So that's a big deal. And look at corn. The overall picture for corn exports is for about 1.7 billion bushels of corn bought ahead and or shipped out of the USDA's projection of about 2.2 billion. So that's no small amounts, about 78% of the way to fulfilling the USDA's projection. We're only about 8 weeks in, 15% of the way to there. So a lot of pre-buying. And of course, pre-buying can be reversed, but but to the degree it remains dry in parts of South America, et cetera, then the chances of these purchases actually coming to bear are pretty good. So you look at corn, and of course, China's big player, 1.87 million metric tons of accumulated exports so far, 8.7 outstanding sales. That's to China. But when you look at Mexico, accumulated exports about 1.7 million metric tons, just behind China, and forward purchases of about 4.01. So it's those Chinese purchases that have doubled that for Mexico, but still a big thing. I would also say when we look at grain sorghum, the whole story, 99% of the accumulated exports and of the purchases, they're almost all China for U.S. grain sorghum. In fact, the pace of grain sorghum so far, exports in terms of actual shipments, has been just so-so. You look at wheat side of things, and for wheat exports, we have forward shipments and purchases all told, accounting for about 61% of the USDA's projection, or about 40% of the way through the marketing year, about week 21. So when you look at all U.S. wheat exports, China has a hand in there, but it's not as big of a play at about 1.2 million metric tons out of 10.6 that have been shipped so far. Compare that to Mexico, it's almost exactly matches what Mexico's bought. But the forward purchases for China, 371,000 metric tons, but forward purchases for Mexico kind of dwarf China's at just over 1 million metric tons of forward purchases coming out of Mexico. So China gets the headlines, but Mexico gets the cash in terms of the actual movement and how important it is to us. Mm-hmm. I would say also for soybeans, you got the same Mexico and China interplay going on. For soybeans, when you look at actual shipments so far, accumulated exports, China 10.1 million metric tons. Mexico comes in pretty small relative to that, about 712,000 metric tons. Forward purchases for China, 15.8 million metric tons. Mexico coming in at 1.8. So in the soybean world, where China basically has shipped 72% of the world's of U.S. soybeans so far, that's where this Mexico-China thing kind of falls apart. So Mexico holds up pretty strong in corn and wheat exports, but China just such a dominant player on the soybean side that it's really shows.
Fundamentally, this is all good foundation for these markets to move ahead once we get past all the fervor, hopefully, of the election and all those things associated with that. Dan, as you are wont to do fairly routinely, you've put another price probability projection together this time and this week for corn, the likelihoods of prices.
Well, there is some chance that the USDA's production number could still move lower, but let's say that's 100 million bushels or something. So that wouldn't be a lot of price change out of that, really. The big potential would be as if China does come into the markets and the USDA does acknowledge, some of the purchases that are on the books, literally in the corn market. And say if we look at, say, 250 million bushels more of China purchases, everything else being equal, 500 million bushels more, everything else being equal, and 750 million bushels more. Well, in so many words, what's happening is that instead of 2.1, 2.2 billion bushels of carry out, then, you had 250, then million bushels of Chinese exports. You take the U.S. ending stocks down to 1.9% stocks to use. It adds about 10, 15 cents to the price. You're still at about 13% stocks to use. But those next steps, up to 500 million, again, you're getting ending stocks to use down to 1.6, 1.7. That'd be ending stocks to use about 11%. Price conservatively moving, this is the cash price, to about 418. And then if you get the full 750 million bushels coming into play, then ending stocks down below 1.5 billion, down to about 1.4, and 9% stocks to use, and 460 as a price. And those numbers are conservative relative to what some other models are saying. And really, probably what I'm implicitly doing with these more conservative numbers is saying, gosh, if we do jump up exports that sharply, we're going to start to bid away some other use from elsewhere in livestock feeding, ethanol, you name it.
This is not to rule out $5 corn, but as you're suggesting, there is a multitude of what-ifs there.
And these are season average prices. So, we're laying a foundation right now of where prices are at, and you would get spikes in the middle of all that. And that probably come in January, February, maybe early March, before the bulk of what's coming out of South America would be available in the market. So, yeah, a lot of times we look to January, February and say, gosh, that's our doldrums. We hope we survive until we get something out in the spring. But in the way things are set up here now, it seems that there's a chance that December, January, February could be a pretty decent time if exporters come in and want to obtain supplies, and the inevitable that will happen also that U.S. farmers will want to hold and make sure they get the best price possible.
Well, Dan, when we talk next, which will be next Friday, the tumultuous nature of these markets hopefully will have tamed down. We shall see, but all of these things not necessarily associated with grain supply and demand, if they go by the wayside, that gives a little more concrete idea of where we may be headed.
We still need food, and we still need energy, and a whole number of ag product flows of both raw products and processed products to keep moving through our system. So you would think those functions will continue. It's just more a matter of how roiled up the populace is in financial and other economic markets with regard to how they feel their future will be going forward. Will there be optimism, pessimism, or probably some great big combination of the whole bunch?
And in the meantime, we'll welcome the fundamentals back with open arms.
Amen.
Many thanks to you as always, Dan. We'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Eric.
From his office in Colby, Northwest Kansas, grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension, and once more be sure to check out his weekly notes on the grain trades at agmanager.info. You are tuned to Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
We're back now on This Agriculture Today, and back with us once more is Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. We've invited him back in today to talk more about management of soil fertility in the fall, and more directly, Dorivar, taking soil samples for nutrient levels here in the fall. There's an extra influence this year on that, you say, and that would be our persistently dry soils in Kansas. And this is important, you say.
Yes, Eric. Of course, soil sampling, collecting soil samples in the fall is typically a good time for sampling in general. We finish with harvest. We're basically planning for fertility for next year. And so it's typically a popular time of the year to collect soil sample. And certainly every year is, in my opinion, one of the best times really for soil sampling. However, this year, of course, with the dry soils, we do have some considerations. A few things that we need to keep in mind. One of the things that we are seeing, of course, is just with dry soils, trying to maintain consistent sampling depth is something that could be a challenge. And I do see this oftentimes, especially in no-till systems where we know we do have some level of stratification, especially of immobile nutrients like phosphorus. And again, if we're not keeping that sampling depth consistent, obviously we're going to be introducing more variability in our results, and ultimately that's going to affect our recommendation system. So that's one aspect that we need to keep in mind this year, again, as we are thinking about collecting samples and planning fertility for next year.
How does one keep that consistency in taking those soil cores for sampling then?
Yes, in most cases, typically what we need to do is just emphasize that. And of course, it's a challenge with the dry soils to collect those samples, but The consistency of sampling depth is really important in this case because of the stratification. And what we need to do is basically just emphasize, and despite of the dry soils, try to emphasize that consistency. And that's really the key in this case. Because again, if we are collecting more shallow samples, in many cases that will be affecting our recommendations significantly. The other thing that we need to keep in mind also for how soil tests may be affected by dry conditions is the cycling of nutrients that we see in some cases, more for some nutrients in particular. A couple examples that we see very often is for phosphorus and potassium. We have to keep in mind that especially potassium tend to cycle back from the crop residue in significant amounts back to the soil. And this is available potassium that basically will show up in the soil test. In other words, if we do have dry conditions, no precipitation to basically leach that potassium from crop residue and back to the soil, most of that potassium will stay in the residue, and essentially we're not going to see it in the soil test that we are collecting right now, in the soil sample that we are collecting now. So again, that's one example that in some cases we may actually be seeing a little bit lower values because of the dry conditions. And so again, we need to keep that in mind as we are interpreting those results. And as we're planning our recommendation, if suddenly we do see a value that is significantly lower than what we typically see in our crop history, in our field history, keep in mind that this could be an artifact of the dry conditions that we have this year. And so that's one consideration. Like I say, especially for potassium is something that we see very clearly. So it will be more of a challenge for those in eastern and southeast part of the state where potassium limitation could be a big factor. We also do see some level of phosphorus that basically move from the residue back to the soil. The amount of phosphorus is typically lower. However, that can also affect your soil test results. So again, those are some things to keep in mind. P and K, perhaps a little bit lower than usual. Keep in mind that this could be the effect of just dry conditions this year if we are collecting samples before any precipitation.
And this is a basic question, but when we think about taking these samples in the fall, as opposed to waiting until the spring, whatever values one comes up with now in the fall, those will not change very much until springtime. We can rely on that information come application time in the spring.
That's an excellent point, Eric. And this is a situation a year, I would say, that in many cases we may actually see some differences in value when we are collecting sample in the spring because of this dry condition. Say if the next few months, during the winter months, we do have more precipitation for some of these nutrients to cycle back to the soil, we may see some differences. And that's the kind of things that we need to keep in mind. And like I say, this is especially important for potassium. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why in many cases we tend to see soil test potassium tends to be more reliable in the spring because we do have more time for that nutrient to cycle back to the soil, essentially. And like I say, in a dry year like this year, this could be a factor that we may see in some of our soil samples. Another factor also to keep in mind, and this is something that we talk about every so often when we sample during dry conditions, is soil pH. And especially soils that may be already low in pH, keep in mind that when we have dry conditions, we typically have some level of salt accumulation basically near the surface, and this is just because of all the evaporation and we don't have any precipitation to move that salt back to the soil profile. So essentially we do have some salt accumulation near the surface, and that usually tends to contribute to lower the pH a little bit. And that can vary anywhere from 0.1 to 0.4 pH units. So that's also another thing to keep in mind. Again, if we're collecting samples right now and we do see some slightly lower pH value, it can also be the effect of the dry conditions that we have right now. So those are some things to keep in mind, some considerations. Obviously, again, we just discussed about spring sampling. And if you have the flexibility to move the soil sampling for later in the winter or maybe even spring, it may be a better situation. However, we know that leaves very little time for making decisions for fertilizer applications and so on. So we have to balance that situation essentially. If we need to collect samples now, again, just keep in mind that we are collecting samples with very dry conditions, and it may have some small effects on some nutrients, some pH, and again, try to maintain that sampling depth as consistent as possible. those are some key things that we need to keep in mind.
Good input for our producers intending on soil sampling here in the fall, and there's merit in doing so if one does account for these drier soil conditions and how they might impact those results. Thanks, Dorivar. Appreciate the word right here.
Thank you.
That's from Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Taking us up to the break, want to remind you producers once more about something that we first brought to your attention a few weeks back. Kansas farmers have an opportunity to join other producers across the nation participating in a $4 million conservation innovation project that K-State has a hand in. This is aimed at improving the efficiency of fertilizer and seed management for wheat, corn, soybeans, and cotton production. This research is made possible by a USDA NRCS award to what's called the Data Intensive Farm Management Project. The game plan here is to develop and then deploy a data-intensive crop management system based on on-farm precision experiments. That's where you, the producer, would come in. Participating farmers will use precision agriculture tools to conduct site-specific and data-based evaluations of site-specific nitrogen, phosphorus, and seed rate management strategies. The lead on this project here in Kansas is K-State precision agricultural economist Terry Griffin.
We've been trying to develop ways of analyzing data that comes from our combines and cotton pickers and conducting analysis of on-farm experiments that farmers have been doing themselves over many decades. And we're trying to develop these tools to analyze the data, to manage that data. And we're ready to push some of these things from the research and applied research side to the farm and make these available. And hopefully that these will be picked up by the farm management information software and other farm mapping software to be used at the farm level from here on out. So there's 18 states in this project sponsored by NRCS. Farmers will be able to partner with someone from the team. So we have people who will be dedicated to assist farmers with the design of the experiment and what to do and some advice on what not to do and provide some resources. The farmers, private consultants can take part in this. There's some subsidies that both of those parties can apply for to help offset some of the expenses. It's not enough to pay them to be researchers, but it will pay to offset some of the costs that they incur from participating.
K-State's Terry Griffin there to find out more about this data-intensive farm management project. And how you might become involved, you can contact Terry directly via email, twgriffin@ksu.edu. Again, twgriffin@ksu.edu. And you can find out more as well on the project's website, as easy as searching for Data Intensive Farm Management Project. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. In a few moments, today's agricultural news headlines are coming your way, as well as this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop with Marcia Boswell. And again, Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather, right here on the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Welcome back to this Friday edition of Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. Now today's agricultural news headlines for you, these courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the USDA's forecast that China's 2021 corn imports from all sources would be at 7 million metric tons has prompted many questions about that forecast, in no small part because U.S. export commitments for corn to China alone stood at 10.5 million metric tons as of October the 15th. Keep in mind that export sales do get canceled at times. Those are the words of World Agriculture Outlook Board Chairman Mark Jekanowski. He shared that during a virtual USDA data users meeting this week. Now, China's tariff rate quota for corn was maintained at 7.2 million metric tons for calendar year 21, but expectations are that China's government will issue additional import quotas or take other actions to bring in more corn than that announced TRQ level for next year. And the fact that there has been no formal announcement factors into the Outlook Board decision, according to Jekanowski. One of the things that he says they try not to do is forecast changes in policy, including changes in policy by foreign countries. Chinese corn prices have hit lofty levels as demand for corn there is high. They're seeking to rebuild their hog herd that was decimated by African swine fever, and that country has sought to dramatically reduce the use of swill to feed its hogs. Meantime, China's purchases of U.S. pork outright continues strong, as we hear now from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
The Agriculture Department's Undersecretary for Trade said he's very pleased with what China is doing as far as trying to meet Phase 1 trade agreement commitments. Ted McKinney told a pork webinar put on by AgriPulse.
Things have been going relatively well in China, and we're very grateful that they are stepping up to honor as much as they can of the Phase 1 agreement, and that pork, in this case, is a big part of that.
It is. U.S. sales of pork to China up 327% compared to last year, and that's with the current 25% tariff on U.S. pork. China has been buying record amounts of pork from many countries as it recovers from its African swine fever outbreak, but McKinney said as China also makes the transition to larger, more efficient hog production facilities,
purchases of finished pork will probably slide a bit in China at some point in the future.
And, of course,
that means we've got to find new markets.
McKinney said he gets teased about saying this next thing all the time, but it's true.
We're leaving no stone unturned.
Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Young people from Arkansas, California, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, and Missouri were elected by national FFA delegates during the 93rd National FFA Convention to serve as the 2020-21 National FFA officers last evening. Candidates take part in an extensive online interview process with the nominating committee leading up to that selection. Doster Harper of the Georgia FFA was elected national president. Anna Mathis of the Arkansas FFA, National Secretary. Paxton Dahmer of the Missouri FFA was elected Central Regional Vice President. Miriam Hoffman of the Illinois FFA, the Eastern Region Vice President. David Lopez of the California FFA, Western Region Vice President. And Arthur Jonasaint of the Florida FFA, elected Southern Region Vice President. Now, noting that Kansas FFA member Abby Goins of the Labette County chapter was among those 22 finalists, while she was not selected to a national office, being a finalist is a monumental achievement in and of itself. So our congratulations to Abby for that. Well, the numbers are now in on the end-use quality of the 2020 Kansas wheat crop, and the milling and baking ratings of hard white wheat varieties in particular really stood out. Marcia Boswell has the story on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
The Kansas hard white wheat crop is exhibiting good milling and baking quality, even though production was down in 2020, according to the annual Crop Quality Report published by U.S. Wheat Associates. Released last week, the report includes grade, flour, and baking data for all 6 U.S. wheat classes. The report includes analysis of hundreds of samples collected during and after harvest to provide objective information for the world's wheat buyers. According to Vince Peterson, U.S. Wheat Associates president, we are pleased to share the 2020 U.S. Wheat Crop Quality Report with our customers, partners, and friends. While the global pandemic kept us apart in distance, it is not going to prevent us from providing the information customers need to put the 6 U.S. wheat classes to work in their businesses. According to the report, the 2020 hard white wheat crop demonstrated good quality in milling performance, dough properties, and in finished products like pan breads, Asian noodles, and steamed breads. U.S. wheat and member organizations like the Kansas Wheat Commission are now taking this analysis out to customers to discuss both last year's quality and the outlook for the hard white wheat just planted. Matt Overturf, Director of Grain Marketing for Skyland Grain in Johnson, echoed the good quality of this year's hard white wheat crop, despite a significant drop in production. The company only took in about 40% of their 5-year average, with an even more substantial drop year over year. This decreased production was driven by crop rotations into other dryland crops and substantial drought conditions in the western parts of the state, where the majority of hard white is grown. Despite lower acres, Overturf reported that the hard white wheat delivered to their locations had good protein and test weights. He also said the company's location in Cunningham, which is Kingman County, took in hard white wheat for the first time, and it was also of good quality. While the majority of this wheat is destined for domestic use, Skyland has made some sales to Nigeria prior to the start of the competing Australian harvest. Looking forward, Overturf expects hard white production in western Kansas to rebound substantially, in part due to prevent plant acres from this summer that shifted back to wheat production. Farmers in western Kansas also benefit from varieties like Joe that include resistance to diseases like wheat streak mosaic virus and KS Silverado, which is growing in popularity in central Kansas. He reported the hard white wheat now in the ground is off to a good start, but farmers are keeping their fingers crossed for moisture soon to support plant growth. Overturf said, "Our farmers like to grow hard white wheat out here, and we like handling it. When somebody is looking for hard white wheat to buy, they can come to us, and we usually have a pretty good supply." Learn more about the quality analysis of the 2020 hard white wheat crop at uswheat.org. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And this quick note, the Commodity Classic, the annual national conference for wheat, corn, soybean, and sorghum growers, announced this morning its event for 2021 will be virtual. It's typically held in late February and early March. It was slated to return to San Antonio for 2021, but it will now be virtual in March. This is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Now for you on Agriculture Today, our weekly visit with K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp, covering Kansas agricultural weather. Mary's on the road today, but has been good enough to set aside a few moments to talk with us right here about, among other things, Mary, moisture relief in parts of southern Kansas this past week, but no such thing elsewhere. Fill us in on the details.
Right. When we look at how much moisture came, there was a very nice area of precip in the south central and into southeast, where we were looking at as much as 5 inches in one location, a widespread area of 3 or more. But again, with those, we're really looking at having that heavy rain. It was in that south central, southeastern corner, and you didn't have to go very far before you weren't seeing nearly so much. Some places got some fairly nice moisture. Liberal, for example, did see significant rains, but then you get up to Dodge City and Garden City and it drops off, and if you go up into northwest Kansas, it was pretty much a wash. They may have gotten as much as 1/4 of an inch in a couple of places, but that's certainly not going to make major inroads on the drought in that area. And talking about drought, there was not much improvement in the drought monitor this week because most of the rains fell after the cutoff point on Tuesday. So it will be in next week's monitor where we'll see the biggest changes, and that, again, is likely to be in the south central, southeast, maybe edging a little bit into the southwest. Again, like I said, over towards the Liberal area, but not much further than that. Some beneficial moisture in central Kansas, where we're looking at 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. But again, north central, northwest didn't get nearly so generous amounts.
Now, in as far as soil moisture, and the Mesonet website out of K-State routinely tracks that, if we look back at the USDA's weekly crop progress and condition report issued a few days ago, the storyline there was that Kansas remained extremely strapped for soil moisture. What are the latest numbers you have, Mary?
Right, and you can check the Kansas Mesonet soil moisture map, and you can see just where the biggest impacts were being seen, where you did have those significant rains. You can see the gaps also. You don't go very far, and you go from an 80% saturation at, say, Ashland, and then you go up a little bit further north to Hodgman, and you've got 35% saturation. So again, the changes are most notable in that south central area, and you get up into the northern ones like Colby, Russell Springs. Well, Russell Springs and Cheyenne are at 29, and Colby's at 40. Tribune's at 33. So again, not a really big improvement in those areas, which is to be expected with the lesser amounts of moisture in those areas.
On the temperature side, hard freezes for just about everybody in the state this past week?
This past week, everybody hit the freezing mark. With most of them, the freezing temperatures were of significant duration, so any kind of tender vegetation got it. Looking at just today, the 24-hour low down in that southeast corner, 29 degrees, 30 degrees. So they had a definite freeze. And if we look at the hours below freezing, 5 hours below freezing down in that southeast corner, again, that's going to do a good job of finishing off any of that growth that for the fall harvested crops.
Then, again, referencing the Mesonet website, one assumes that soil temperatures have taken a tumble, have they?
They have taken a tumble, but they're still not super cold. The average soil temperatures across the state are running pretty close to 40, 45 degrees. So it's still warm enough that the wheat and fall planted crops have a chance to emerge and do some growth on that. So it hasn't gotten as cold as we might have thought with the cold air temperatures, but the minimum soil temperatures up in the northwest were 35 for the week, and the 7-day average is running at 40 degrees.
To the outlook then, and it appears to be a return to what was expected of this fall and into winter, dry and warmer for the foreseeable future.
Right. The 7-day quantitative precip forecast for us is 0 precipitation. So they're looking at a very dry pattern for the next 7 days. When we go into the Climate Prediction Center's outlook for the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day, the temperatures stay on the mild side, but there is a chance for some more moisture coming in. Not so much in the 6 to 10 as in the 8 to 14. The 6 to 10 day outlook, there's a slight chance for above normal precip in the north central part of the state. The southern areas of the state are supposed to stay on the dry side. As far as temperature goes, for that 6 to 10, it's warmer than normal and a very strong chance for warmer than normal. The thing that we have to keep in mind is that normal is much cooler than it was at the start of October, so it doesn't necessarily mean super high temperatures. As we go into the 8 to 14 day, which is November 6th through the 12th, another cold front is starting to show. The northwest corner is expected to be a little bit on the cool side, the central part of the state near normal, and only the southeast continues with that warmer pattern. So again, that's evidence of the next cold front that might be coming through.
But once more, that's the week after next, so goes the forecast. Mary, thanks as always, and enjoy the weekend ahead.
Thanks, Eric, and you as well.
Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension, her weekly conversation with us on Kansas agricultural weather here on the broadcast. Thanks for tuning in, and a good weekend to you. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.